He flew on private jets. He drove a $350,000 Bentley. He preached to 25,000 people every Sunday in a sanctuary that looked more like an arena than a church. By every outward measure, Bishop Eddie Long was one of the wealthiest pastors in America. Then he died. And within 6 months, the heirs was knocking on his widow's door for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Within a year, the mansion was sold off for a fraction of what it was worth. And the empire that looked untouchable from the outside started coming apart at the seams, piece by piece. So what actually happened to Eddie Long's money? Where did it go? Who got left holding the bag? And what happened to the family he left behind? Stick with me, because the real story isn't about a fortune that vanished. It's about a fortune that in many ways was never really his to begin with. Before we get into what happened after his death, you need to understand who Eddie Long was and how he built or appeared to build this empire in the first place. Eddie Long took over New Birth Missionary Baptist Church in Lithonia, Georgia, just outside Atlanta, back in the mid-1980s, when it was a modest congregation of a few hundred people. Over the next 2 decades, he turned it into one of the largest churches in the country. At its peak, New Birth claimed roughly 25,000 members. We're talking politicians, professional athletes, entertainers, business leaders, all walking through those doors on a Sunday morning. Long didn't just build a church. He built a brand. He wore designer suits, dripped in jewelry, and cultivated an image that was part preacher, part CEO, part celebrity. He literally wrote a book called Gladiator, A Christian Man's Guide to Spiritual Warfare. And the imagery fit. He saw himself and was seen by many of his followers as a kind of spiritual warrior king. And the lifestyle matched the image. Long lived in a sprawling mansion in DeKalb County, reportedly purchased for around $1.1 million in 2005. He had access to private jets. He drove that Bentley. To the outside world, and frankly, to a lot of people inside his own congregation, it looked like Eddie Long was a very, very rich man. But here's the thing that's easy to miss when you're looking at a private jet or a luxury car. Ownership and access are not the same thing. And that distinction is going to matter a lot as we go through this story. You can't talk about Eddie Long's financial story without talking about 2010. Because that's the year everything changed, not just for his reputation, but for his bank account. In September of 2010, 4 young men filed lawsuits against Long, alleging that he had used his position, his influence, gifts, and even international trips to coerce them into sexual relationships while they were young members of his congregation. The allegations were explosive. They dominated headlines for months. They shook a megachurch that had built its identity, in part, around Long's image as a strong, masculine spiritual leader who preached fiercely against homosexuality from the pulpit. Long denied the allegations publicly, telling his congregation he was not a perfect man but was going to fight the claims. The lawsuits dragged on for roughly 2 years. And then, in 2012, the cases were settled out of court. The exact terms of that settlement were never made public. And that secrecy is actually pretty common in cases like this, but multiple reports at the time indicated the payout was substantial. Now here's where it gets interesting from a financial standpoint. A settlement like that doesn't just disappear into thin air. It has to come from somewhere. And when you're talking about a religious leader whose personal income is intertwined with a tax-exempt nonprofit organization, the lines between his money and the church's money start to get very, very blurry. That same year, 2011, Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa wrapped up a 3-year congressional investigation into the finances of 6 prominent televangelist ministries, and New Birth was one of them. The investigation looked into whether these organizations were properly using their tax-exempt status and how compensation for leaders like Long was being handled. According to reporting at the time, New Birth's staff largely declined to answer many of the Senate committee's questions, including basic ones, like how much Long was actually being paid as senior pastor. Think about that for a second. A sitting U.S. Senator's office couldn't get a straight answer on Eddie Long's salary. That tells you something important. Even before he died, the financial picture around Eddie Long was murky by design. So let's talk about that lifestyle again. The jets, the Bentley, the mansion, because this is where the story gets really interesting. And honestly, where it becomes a cautionary tale that extends way beyond just one pastor. Multiple financial reviews and investigative reports over the years pointed to the same conclusion: A huge portion of what looked like Eddie Long's personal wealth was actually tied up in church-owned assets and his tax-exempt ministry operations. The private jet usage. Vehicle expenses. Even significant portions of his housing arrangement. These weren't necessarily things sitting in Eddie Long's personal name with Eddie Long's personal money behind them. They were benefits and perks flowing through a non-profit religious organization. This is actually a really common structure in megachurch culture, and it's worth pausing on why. When a pastor's lifestyle is funded through the church rather than personal ownership, it creates a kind of optical illusion. From the pews, it looks like God has blessed this man abundantly, and that blessing becomes part of the message, prosperity gospel theology essentially, where wealth is treated as evidence of divine favor. But underneath that image, the actual legal and financial reality can be completely different. The pastor doesn't necessarily own the jet. The pastor doesn't necessarily own the fleet of cars. The ministry does. And the pastor has access to them as long as he holds his position and as long as the ministry's finances can support it. When you understand that structure, what happened to Eddie Long's estate after he died starts to make a lot more sense. In early 2017, news broke that shocked the congregation and the broader religious community. Eddie Long was gravely ill. He had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer, and he had reportedly kept the diagnosis largely private, continuing to lead the church even as his health deteriorated. On January 15, 2017, Bishop Eddie Long passed away. He was 63 years old. The tributes poured in. Politicians, fellow pastors, celebrities, many of them spoke about his impact, his charisma, his ability to build one of the largest congregations in the country from almost nothing. But behind the public mourning, there was a much messier reality unfolding. The reality of what he actually left behind. He was survived by his wife, Vanessa Griffin Long, and their 4 children, sons Eric, Edward, and Jared, and daughter Taylor. And almost immediately, that family was going to have to confront just how complicated and how indebted Eddie Long's financial legacy actually was. Here's where the story takes its sharpest turn. Just months after Long's death, by May of 2017, the Internal Revenue Service filed a notice of a federal tax lien in DeKalb County Superior Court against the estate of Bishop Eddie Long and his widow, Vanessa. The amount the heirs was seeking, $335,216.34. Let that sink in. A man who, from the outside, looked like he was living a multi-millionaire lifestyle, private jets, luxury cars, a mansion, died owing the federal government over $250,000 in unpaid taxes, interest, and penalties. And it wasn't old debt either. Reporting at the time indicated the tax liability stemmed from income earned as recently as 2015, just 2 years before his death. Whatever Long was making in those final years, it wasn't enough, or it wasn't being managed properly to keep him square with the heirs. The lien filing included a pretty blunt line from the federal government: "We have made a demand for payment for this liability, but it remains unpaid." That's about as plain as government paperwork gets. They asked. Nobody paid. So, they filed the lien. Now here's something important to understand about how federal tax liens work after someone dies, because it explains exactly why this hit Vanessa Long the way it did. When a person dies owing federal taxes, that debt doesn't just evaporate. The heirs goes after the estate first, whatever assets, property, and accounts were left behind. It doesn't typically become a personal debt that children or heirs have to pay out of their own separate pocket, but it absolutely can attach to property that was jointly owned, or property that passes through to a surviving spouse, especially if there's a tax lien that predates the death. Vanessa Long, as his widow and as someone whose name was already tied to certain assets and filings, found herself directly named in that lien alongside her late husband's estate. So within half a year of burying her husband, Vanessa Long was dealing with the federal government demanding over $335,000. And then there's the house. The mansion that for years was the physical symbol of Eddie Long's success. The place where cameras would show up, where the lifestyle was on full display. That DeKalb County property had originally been purchased back in 2005 for right around $1.1 million. It was the kind of home that fit the image Long had cultivated. A sprawling estate that visually reinforced the idea that this was a man who had made it, big time. But not long after his death, that mansion was put back on the market. And when it finally sold, It went for a fraction of what it had once been worth, reportedly under half of the original purchase price. For a property that had once stood as a literal monument to Eddie Long's success, that kind of steep markdown told its own story. Estates in financial distress often get liquidated quickly, and quick liquidations rarely fetch top dollar. Whether it was to cover debts, settle the estate, or simply because the family had no desire or no financial ability to maintain a property that size, the mansion was gone. This is the part of the story that I think really crystallizes everything. The home that was supposed to represent generational wealth for the Long family instead became another liability that needed to be cleared off the books. Let's step back for a second and connect the dots, because I think this is the most important part of understanding what happened to Eddie Long's net worth. When you add it all up, the murky, never fully disclosed salary that even a U.S. Senate investigation couldn't pin down, the lavish lifestyle that was substantially propped up by church-owned and ministry-funded assets rather than personal wealth, the undisclosed but reportedly significant settlement paid out in 2012 to resolve the sexual misconduct lawsuits, and then the federal tax lien revealing unpaid taxes right up until close to his death, you start to see a pattern. This wasn't a story about a fortune. This was a story about cash flow. Money came in through the church. Money went out through lawsuits, lifestyle expenses, and apparently unpaid tax obligations. There wasn't some hidden vault of personal wealth sitting untouched, waiting to be inherited. That's a really different story than the one the imagery told for 2 decades. And it's a pattern that shows up again and again with prominent religious leaders who build empires around personal charisma rather than personal assets. The jet isn't always the pastor's jet. The mansion's maintenance isn't always coming out of the pastor's pocket. And when the leader dies, or when the scandal hits, or when the ears starts asking questions, that distinction between access and ownership becomes the difference between a family inheriting wealth and a family inheriting a mess. Now let's talk about Vanessa, because her story is honestly one of the more complicated threads in all of this. Back in 2011, right in the middle of the scandal and the lawsuits, Vanessa Long actually filed for divorce from Eddie. It made headlines at the time. Here was the wife of the embattled bishop, seemingly ready to walk away while the allegations were swirling and the church was in crisis. But that divorce filing didn't go through. Vanessa ultimately withdrew the petition, and the couple stayed together. She remained by his side through the rest of the lawsuits, through the settlement, and all the way through his cancer diagnosis and death in 2017. After his passing, Vanessa Long found herself in an incredibly difficult position. She wasn't just grieving her husband, she was the one left to deal with the ears lien, the liquidation of the mansion, and whatever remained of an estate that turned out to be far more complicated and far more indebted than the public image had ever suggested. On top of the personal financial fallout, she also remained connected to New Birth itself during a period of intense instability for the church, helping the congregation navigate the search for new leadership in the wake of her husband's death. It's worth pausing on that for a second. Vanessa Long didn't just lose her husband. She inherited the cleanup, the tax bills, the property sale, the uncertainty, for a lifestyle that, as we now know, was never as financially secure as it appeared from the outside. So what about the 4 kids? Eric, Edward, Jared, and Taylor. Unlike what you might expect from the children of a man who, for years, looked like one of the wealthiest pastors in America, Eddie Long's kids did not inherit some sprawling financial empire. They largely stayed out of the public eye after their father's death, avoiding the kind of high-profile spotlight that often follows the children of major religious or political figures. And honestly, given everything we've just walked through, the tax lien, the liquidated mansion, the assets that were tied up in church ownership rather than personal family trusts, that outcome makes complete sense. Most of what looked like the Long family fortune was never structured as personal generational wealth. It was structured as ministry infrastructure. The jets, many of the vehicles, a significant portion of the lifestyle, all of that belonged, in a legal and financial sense, to New Birth and its associated nonprofit entities, not to the Long family individually. There was actually one moment where Eddie Long's eldest son, Edward, stepped into the spotlight in a meaningful way. When New Birth was searching for a new senior pastor after his father's death, reports surfaced that Edward Long had applied for the position himself, hoping, perhaps, to carry on his father's legacy from the same pulpit. But the church did not select him. After considering well over 100 candidates, New Birth's leadership ultimately went in a different direction entirely. That detail says a lot, actually. It tells you that whatever legacy Eddie Long left behind, it wasn't automatically passed down to his children, not the pulpit, and as we've seen, not really the money either. Here's the twist in this whole story. The real empire Eddie Long built wasn't a personal fortune at all. It was the institution, New Birth Missionary Baptist Church itself. And after his death, that institution went through its own turbulent period of trying to figure out what came next. The first man to step into the role after Long's passing was Bishop Stephen A. Davis, who had been running a satellite congregation connected to New Birth down in Birmingham, Alabama. Davis took over the senior pastor role shortly after Long died. But his tenure didn't last especially long. He resigned in June of 2018 after about a year and a half at the helm. That kicked off a fresh search for New Birth's next leader, and it turned into a much bigger process than you might expect. Leadership eventually narrowed a pool of 138 candidates down to a final 2. In November of 2018, the church announced its choice, Pastor Jamal Bryant, the founder of Empowerment Temple in Baltimore, who had built that congregation from just a few dozen members up to roughly 10,000. Bryant delivered his first official sermon as New Birth's senior pastor on December 9, 2018. It's worth noting that Bryant didn't tiptoe around the elephant in the room. In the wake of Long's death, he publicly pushed back on the idea that the church should simply move past the sexual misconduct allegations without reckoning with them, saying the body of Christ owed something to the people who had come forward as accusers. That's a notably different posture than the silence that had largely surrounded the allegations during Long's lifetime. By the time Bryant took over, New Birth's membership had fallen dramatically from its peak, from around 25,000 members in the church's heyday down to roughly 10,000 by the time of the leadership transition. That decline says a lot about just how much damage the 2010 scandal did, not just to Eddie Long's personal finances and reputation, but to the entire institution he spent decades building. So, zooming all the way out, what's the actual lesson in the Eddie Long story? I think it's this. Image and reality are not the same thing, especially in the world of megachurch culture. For years, the public saw a man who appeared to be one of the wealthiest, most powerful religious leaders in America. The jets. The Bentley. The mansion. The 25,000-member congregation. Every visual cue told you this was a man who had built generational wealth. But when you actually pull back the layers, when you look at what a Senate investigation couldn't get answers about, when you look at what an ears lean revealed just months after his death, when you look at what a mansion sale at a steep discount actually told you, and when you look at the fact that his own children didn't inherit anything close to an empire, the real picture comes into focus. Eddie Long had access to enormous wealth during his lifetime, but access and ownership are two very different things. And when he died, that distinction became impossible to ignore. His widow was left to deal with federal tax debt. His mansion was sold for a fraction of its value. His children moved on with their lives outside the spotlight, without inheriting the empire that the public assumed was theirs to inherit. And the actual institution he built, the one piece of his legacy that genuinely had staying power, needed an entirely new leader and an entirely new direction to try to rebuild what the scandal years had broken. It's a story that's been repeated in different forms across the prosperity gospel landscape for decades. The image of wealth is often the product. The actual wealth, when you dig into it, tells a much more complicated story. So that's the real story of what happened to Eddie Long's fortune, his estate, and the family he left behind. Not a hidden treasure, not generational riches passed down to his kids, just a tangled, debt-laden estate, a widow left to clean it up, and an institution that had to completely rebuild itself from the ground up. If you found this breakdown interesting, let me know in the comments what other stories like this you want me to dig into next, because Eddie Long is far from the only example of this pattern playing out in the world of megachurch leadership. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.